Gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. We have a first-time guest today who I'm very excited about. One could say that in the sort of the bestiary of Washington animals, he is an apex predator in some ways. He's been around for a while. For a long time, he was a foreign power. I'll just read you the short bio. Makes it easier. Robert D. Kaplan is the best-selling author of 22 books on foreign affairs and travel, translated into many languages. Among them are The Loom of Time, The Tragic Mind, Adriatic, The Good American, The Revenge of Geography, Asia's Cauldron, The Coming Anarchy, and Balkan Ghosts. He holds the Robert Strauss Hoope Chair, I'll get correction on pronunciation if I need it, in geopolitics at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He was a foreign affairs reporter for The Atlantic for 3 decades. Defense Advisory Board, Foreign Policy twice named him one of the world's top 100 global thinkers. And he has a new book out. We are actually recording on pub date, The Loom of Time, Between Empire and Anarchy, from the Mediterranean to China. Robert Kaplan, thank you so much for coming on.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Jonah.
I have many questions for you, but the very first is one I ask all authors when they come on, because it's the question I always want to get when I'm on a book tour. What's your book about?
Well, the book is about the greater Middle East, from Greece to Western China, essentially. So it's more than the Arab world, more than just Persia, more than just Turkey. And it's a kind of book nobody writes anymore, I like to think. Because it's not political science completely. It's not history completely. It's travel. It's memoir. It's a lot of reporting, interviewing dozens of people in many countries. It's sort of an old-fashioned generalist book about a vast region. And the reason I subtitle it Between Empire and Anarchy, I think it's because Washington sees things between democracy and authoritarianism. But from the region's point of view, you have these two extremes of the legacy of empire, and that's not just the British or French Empire, it's the Ottomans, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, and many others. It's imperial rule of one sort or of another, Western or non-Western, going back hundreds and thousands of years. And it's anarchy on the other extreme. It's how to come up, my main theme is, and everyone I speak to and interview throughout the region, is how can we get to some happy middle ground between these two extremes? That it may be democratic, it may not be, but even if it's not, it gives people a sense of dignity, and it's consultative government. Like we see in Morocco and Oman, in Jordan, which are the least repressive regimes, in the region, so to speak. So that's what the book's about, and essentially.
So it's funny. I'm so torn on some of this because I am very much against teleology, and I think we should be incredibly grateful for Western liberal democratic capitalism because it's unnatural. Right. There's a big theme. I take one of the big themes I take from your stuff is the more sort of traditional authoritarian, not brutal and cruel, but just traditionally ordered traditional societies, tribal societies, religious societies. That is the norm in the world through all time. And what we think of as natural is actually profoundly unnatural.
I completely agree. Yeah.
And so I'm very sympathetic with that aspect of your writing, and I get a lot out of it. At the same time, I wonder if, because I'm with you that not all authoritarianisms are alike, but would it be more helpful as a structure, as a framework, if we talked about rule of law based societies versus non-rule of law based societies? Because I think you can have some forms of authoritarianism that are rule of law based, that aren't necessarily democracies or not necessarily entirely liberal as we would understand it.
Yes, obviously you can, because just because there's no elections doesn't mean there aren't rules and regulations. and doesn't mean people can't criticize things in the society. For instance, in Saudi Arabia, and particularly in the Gulf Arab states, you have a kind of social contract, meaning that the rulers deliver predictable governance with predictable, smooth transitions of power, no chaos, no revolutions, predictable lifestyle. People can go about their business. They can criticize bureaucracies on Twitter if they're not working very well. Just don't touch the regime. Just don't say anything bad about the regime. And that's the basic social contract. The people are fine. We won't touch the regime, but you have to provide good governance, good, stable governance. And that more or less works throughout the monarchies, the sultanates of the Arabian Gulf. It also works in Morocco, in Jordan, in Oman, where you get, and I go into this in the book, the real extreme, brutal, totalitarian regimes, or just crazy regimes, like Libya under Gaddafi, Syria, particularly under Bashar al-Assad, less so under his father, Hafez al-Assad, and Iraq under the various Ba'athist dictators culminating in Saddam Hussein. You get something that's extreme. See, one of the things I've learned as a foreign correspondent over decades is the world is not neatly divided, Jonah, between exemplary democracies and horrible dictatorships. There's a lot of gray areas in between. And there are a lot of countries where it's a gray area in between, where it's, illiberal democracies, livable dictatorships. And that's what you find. It's about noticing distinctions between regimes rather than just erecting two artificial categories.
Yeah, I mean, I've often said that if I had to pick one institution that I wanted to be working properly and live in a society, it would be honest courts rather than honest elections. Because as long as you have that key to get out of real trouble, that's fair. It seems to me I'd rather live under a regime, an authoritarian regime with the Bill of Rights strictly adhered to, than a democratic regime where everything was an open question for voters and whatnot. But all right, so on the age of empire part, all right, or the issue of empire part, how do you fit China into its? Because on the one hand, it has an ancient history of being an empire. On the other hand, it doesn't have an ancient history of being imperial in the Middle East. So just give us a tour of what they're doing and how you see it.
Yeah, China is so old it almost doesn't have a beginning. It goes back thousands of years. It had a fully developed bureaucracy during the time of the Roman Empire, etc. China always saw itself as the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom, and every place else was marginal, so to speak. And this gave them a sort of confidence so that they're not a missionary orient. They don't have a missionary oriented foreign policy the way we have had, promoting a system of governance. They'll deal with anybody. They'll deal with crooks, dictators, honest Democrats in Western Europe, whatever, as long as they can get their oil and gas and sell their consumer products, they'll deal with anyone. They're buying more gas and oil from Saudi Arabia and Iran than almost anyone else in the world, They're also building this vast project in the Suez Canal and building a whole new capital for Egypt. So they're everywhere in the Middle East. I was in Ethiopia. The skyscrapers are all built by the Chinese in Addis Ababa. The hand of the Chinese are everywhere in the greater Middle East. And you even see, they have a military base in Djibouti at the mouth of the Red Sea. They have their eyes on a second military base in Port Sudan. They have a state-of-the-art port with military applications in Gwadar, which is the southwestern tip of Pakistan, but it's actually the Middle East because it's by the entrance to the Persian Gulf. So China is really seeking to use the Middle East as a kind of conduit between its trade interests in Europe and its power in East Asia. And I think that this is really what's influenced the Biden administration in terms of seeking a rapprochement between the Saudis and the Israelis. This fear of China, the fear that if they don't erect a kind of mini Pax Americana of their own between the Saudis and the Israelis, the Chinese will continue to replace us in the Middle East.
I was listening to your podcast you did with John Gray for Intelligence Squared, and I agree with you. I've written a couple LA Times columns about how I get frustrated when people refer to U.S. and China relations as a new Cold War. And I don't mind it as long as you use a lowercase c and a lowercase w, but it's apples to orange. It's not even apples and oranges. It's apples and cinder blocks comparison between what the Cold War was about and whatever our hostilities or antagonisms with China are about in terms of historical parallels. But I wonder if you could sort of explain what you think. Let me put it this way. I struggle with this a lot, is that the Soviet Union was basically a unique threat, but also a convenient one because it was not part of the global economy. We didn't depend on it for the global economy. And the kind of threat that it posed was in some ways more ideological. It captured the imaginations of a lot of, whether you want to call them useful idiots or idealistic people, we can have an argument about that. But it was the aspirational nature of the Soviet Union appealed to a lot of people and made them blind to the reality of it. It seems to me China doesn't have that kind of ideological appeal in the world. It is, as you put it, much more, as you describe it, is much more transactional. And so I'm trying to think, is the best historical comparison to our relationship with China sort of like America versus, say, Germany at the beginning of the 20th century, which was a major commercial power as well? I mean, is there a historical antecedent that would help us sort of calibrate this?
It's hard to come up with one. I've always used Cold War in lowercase for the U.S. and China. And used it just as an entry point to describe the differences, which, as you say, the Soviet Union didn't have an economy. And to go further than that, because the Soviet Union lacked a real economy, U.S.-European relations and U.S.-Japanese relations were simplistic, because we were all trading with each other. And it's not like now where the Europeans are trading with China and, the Germans want to have China as their main trading partner and to get security protection from the United States. There are much precisely because China is the second largest economy in the world and the Soviet Union didn't have an economy. Relations between Western allies are much more complex and challenging now than they were during the original Cold War. And also because it's not ideological and and the Chinese deal with regimes in a transactional basis, they're much more appealing to regimes in the Middle East. Because remember, the Middle East is an area from Morocco to Pakistan. It's like a fourth of the circumference of the earth where there's no working democracy anywhere. Pakistan is really a military state that holds elections, essentially. There's no working democracy. So that, as Saudis told me repeatedly in Riyadh, they like China. China buys their oil, buys their gas, and here's the kicker, doesn't give them any lectures about democracy or human rights. And this was at the height of the division between the Biden administration and China and the Biden administration in Saudi Arabia when I was in Saudi about a year ago, where they were really upset with the Biden administration for constantly condemning them on human rights. And the Saudis would say, we hear none of this from China. And by the way, in terms of social reforms, we've been liberalizing more than any Saudi regime in the past. And we're the only part of the Arab Spring that's actually working, even though it's without elections and even though it's combined with authoritarianism. So China has an appeal precisely because they're not ideological, and because but it's mainly because they're such a big customer for oil and gas. And so far, at least, their military footprint in the greater Middle East is small. It's growing, but it's small. So they're not seen as threatening as the Americans are.
I gather, and you feel free to correct me. I gather your general attitude towards American foreign policy should be one of nuanced realism, right? Or nuanced offensive realism, if we want to get theoretical, where we have a calm like we see them approach to specific regimes, specific relationships, and not get so hung up on the democracy stuff. So why don't you flesh it out rather than me characterize your foreign policy approach? Because I want to get to a theoretical conversation a little bit with you, even though I want to get back to the travelogue stuff too.
Sure. I see myself as a realist internationalist. Because of the tragic nature of the Iraq War, realism went isolationist after the Iraq War. And we see examples of that, So realism is confused now with neo-isolationism. That's not the realism I'm close to. When I think of realism, I think of James Baker, George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, people like that, and even people like Jake Sullivan, on the Democratic side. I think once people get into government and wear 3 laminated tags around their neck, they all become realists instantly because they have to deal with U.S. interests. They have to deal with the world as it is, not the way they would want it to be. They may be able to nudge it in the direction of where they want it to be, but they're basically dealing with, with strategic and economic interests and things like that. And so I'm like a realist internationalist. Like, my hero is like George Shultz. George Shultz promoted the Helsinki process, from President Carter once Reagan got into office. George Shultz did a lot of good due to famine and human rights emergencies in Africa. Nobody can criticize him really on human rights and other things. But at the same time, he supported the introduction of SS-20 Pershing missiles into Germany in 1983 to counter the Soviets' SS-22s at a time when there are, millions of Europeans demonstrating against it. It was like this combination of realism with humanity. That's like my avatar.
Let me rephrase it this way. Is there a place in foreign policy for idealism in terms of goals? Is it just a matter of rhetoric? Is it a matter for ends but not means? I mean, is there anything that America can do to, you use the word nudge. What can nudging actually mean as an ideological or theoretical construct?
Right. Look, if there was no idealism in our foreign policy, what would there be to distinguish our foreign policy with that of the Chinese? Because they're realists too, after a fashion. No, idealism has a big place in American foreign policy. I think the best way of putting it was put by Henry Kissinger in his first book when he was 26 years old. He said, someone in power has to deal with what is just and what is possible. What is just depends on the morals of your own society, of your own Western society. What is possible, though, has to take into account the way of doing things of other societies half a world away, which may not share your morals. So the idea is to combine the two, combine what is just with what is possible. And you're always coming up short in the real world, in most cases, but it's a balance.
I'll kill myself if I don't ask you a couple more personal life questions, and then I want to come back to the ideological stuff. Anybody who's read your essays and books over the years, it is like on unfolding geography quiz. Like, you've been pretty much everywhere as far as I can tell. So first of all, what does your passport look like? I mean, is it just crammed with weird visas?
Yeah, it is. But, I have a business passport, which any of us can buy. It costs a little bit more money. What distinguishes it is it has that twice as many pages as a normal passport. And I'm at the point I have to renew my passport next year, and it's already got so many stamps in it. And do you ever have this experience at passport control? They stamp you in, but then you have to figure out what page they put the stamp in, because when they stamp you out, they want to find it. And when you have a whole book crammed with stamps, sometimes I'm fiddling for like 20 minutes finding that entry stamp. So that's what my passport looks like.
Is there a country you haven't been to?
Yeah, there are many. I'm very superficial on visiting Latin America. I mean, I've been to Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia, but I've never been to Bolivia or Ecuador or Chile. I've never been to Petersburg, to St. Petersburg. I always wanted to go there. I can't now under the present regime, because I think it's irresponsible for an American to travel to Russia, because they could be taken hostage and then the government has to spend all this money to get you out, kind of. I've never been to Petersburg. I've never been to Denmark. There are, quite a number of places I haven't been and I haven't covered. I've never been to Southern Africa, never been to South Africa or Namibia.
I'm surprised you haven't been to Denmark, because that's sort of, according to Francis Fukuyama, that's what the entire planet is trying to get to is Denmark. You think you want to, check it out. What's Frank talking about? You do all of this traveling. I'm not looking for your sources and methods and all that kind of stuff, but you've been doing this for a long time. I assume when you were a younger man, your tolerance for horrible sleeping conditions was greater than it is now?
Much greater.
Yeah. How do you plan this stuff?
It's just so much harder now because of age, because with age, you want more conveniences. You just do, and you have things that you're insecure about that you couldn't give a heck about, 20 or 30 years earlier. So I'm not nearly as intrepid as I used to be, but I use intrepid with quotes, because to me, the only real brave people, or most of the real brave people I've encountered, are war photographers. Not writers, but war photographers, because they have to get into real danger zones. A writer can interview people outside of the danger zone. He doesn't have to get to the front line, but it's war photographers who are surprisingly relatively a few people. Mm-hmm. It's not all that many who are the real heroes.
And just what is this most exotic place that, if you were to tell people to put on their bucket list that you've been to, that you would recommend people go to? Is Timbuktu actually worth seeing?
I've been to Timbuktu. Timbuktu is a cliche. Timbuktu, when I was there in 2004, was, a beautiful mud bricked architecture, very, early Islamic design with a lot of satellite dishes, here and there a satellite dish. It was not the edge of the earth. It was, in fact, part of the modern world. It's when you leave Timbuktu and head north into the Sahara that you really get to the edge of the, you get to the edge of the earth. Even back in 2004, Timbuktu had email, it's just a beautiful sounding name, but it's not the end of the world. It's the last place north in Mali before you get to places where nobody really knows what's going on.
All right. So back to this stuff. One of the points you make early in the book is how concepts of nationalism, when introduced to places that were historically always divvied up by empires, with in Turkey with the Young Turks and that kind of thing, how the whole concept of nationalism is ill-fitting in certain parts of the world. Do you think that's still the case, and to what extent?
Well, I think that, one of the problems that the greater Middle East has had with democracy, which is not spoken about it that much, is before you have democracy, you have to have a state. You have to have a modern state of some sort. An empire, starting with the Umayyads in the 7th century and continuing up to the Ottomans governed for 400 years from Algeria to Iraq, right up through the mid-20th century with the British and French mandate system. The Middle East was governed by empires, and that it slowed down the development of modern states. And so if the modern state development has not been historically encouraged, then it's going to be that much harder to establish a democracy. So, it's not that there's something intrinsically difficult with Islam. It's more that this legacy of imperial rule going, where the capital in Damascus, from Morocco to Iraq was under one rule, not just under the Turks, but under all these other dynasties that I mentioned. So that's been the real challenge. Is states. Now, there are a few stable states in the Middle East, obviously. Tunisia is one because it was a state since Roman times with a secular identity since Roman times. It's close to Europe. It's highly educated. It's the most fertile proving ground for a democratic experiment, even though it has slipped back into autocracy of late. Egypt is obviously a state. It's not going to fall apart. A state along the Nile River. I divide the Middle East between what I call, age-old clusters of civilization, which are very coherent, like Tunisia and Egypt and Oman, and places that are just vague geographical expressions like Libya or Syria, where the only thing holding it together was some empire that, if you look at Libya is a good example. It's big, it's vast. Western Libya historically gravitated towards Tunisia. Eastern Libya historically gravitated towards Egypt. And there was nothing much in between. So when the Italians ruled it as one entity for a number of decades, but once Gaddafi, and so because it was not a natural state, it could only be ruled under the most intense form of authoritarianism. So when Gaddafi fell, there was nothing. It just broke into cinders, into dust, essentially.
So when you talk about Tunisia and Egypt, they also have really old conceptions of nationhood too, right? I get the point about, as a development thing, that statehood matters, but national identity matters too. If for whatever reason you could get Erdogan and all the various players to agree to allow the Kurds to make a run of their own country, do you think they would be able to stand up a state pretty quickly? It seems to me that one of the precursors of a functioning state is the legitimacy of a state as expressed as an expression of national identity, or is that just overwrought?
No, it's not. I was in northern Iraq last year, which is the Kurdish part of Iraq. And it's the part of Iraq which functions the best post-U.S. invasion. And it's very safe. You can travel around by buses, taxis, you don't need a bodyguard, nobody's going to rob you or anything of that sort is going to happen. But there are two things about it. It's very corrupt. And I mean abnormally corrupt. It's a cash economy. You can't use credit cards outside of one or two hotels. And as you know, a cash economy is not a traceable economy. So it's a lot of corruption. With plastic comes, some ability to monitor transactions and to tax people. So it's abnormally corrupt. And it's also divided between two clans. Once you're in northern Iraq, there's the northeastern Iraq and northwestern Iraq, which run a bit differently and might as well be two different countries. And what Kurds told me is, yes, we've done well since the U.S. invasion, but not really as well as we should have. We should have the development now of Vietnam or Malaysia, which is a high level of development, but we don't. And that's because of corruption, because we're governed by people who spent their lives fighting the state, fighting Saddam, as guerrillas essentially, and they haven't made the transition into modern governance with rules and regulations and laws and all of that. I think if you have a greater Turkish state, including southeast Turkey, northeast Syria, northern Iraq, it would because of the divisions between the Kurds themselves in this incredibly mountainous area. It's very mountainous. It's given to division, from one valley to the next. When you're, it would probably be a weak state. It would with a lot of divisions, but no weaker than any of the states around it, essentially. Remember, there was supposed to be a greater Kurdistan after World War I, immediately after World War I. It didn't come about because Ataturk proved such a great fighting war leader that he was able to kick the Greeks out of Anatolia and redraw the boundaries, essentially, so that there was a second round of post-World War I peace treaties. But yes, northern Iraq works. It works. It's just not as good as it should be because of corruption.
So when you travel around the Middle East, the standard view, at least in my sort of milieu, about the role of Israel and the Palestinians in the Middle East is that various Arab regimes kind of use them like the Sudeten Germans as this thing to distract their own populations from their own shortcomings, and that the degree to which the average Arab in the street really cared about the plight of the Palestinians. They might have hated Israel, but the degree to which they actually cared about the plight of the Palestinians was diminished. What are you seeing in terms of how the general population or even the elites are making of this, just the rapid détente, for want of a better word, between Israel and Saudi and some of these other countries? The normalization of Israel, is it something that could have a huge blowback, or is it going to, are you optimistic that it's going to proceed apace?
No, I don't think it's going to have a huge blowback. I think, first of all, dealing with the Gulf states, the Abraham Accords under the Trump administration, that was more in the nature of a corporate merger. In the sense that the Gulf Arabs figured out that the Americans are weaker, they're less trustworthy. We have this awful enemy to our north, Iran. And meanwhile, the Israelis are masters of high-tech cyber warfare, and we want some of their technology and everything. So we'll make a very cold-blooded merger, essentially, with them. And because unlike the Egyptians, who fought several wars with the Israelis, Egyptian attitudes towards Israel are very complicated, precisely because it was about territory and blood and wars. The Gulf Arabs really had nothing to do historically with Israel. So they could much easily psychologically make peace. And although the Saudis were not part of the Abraham Accords officially, behind the scenes, they gave their blessing to it, or else it couldn't have happened in the first place. Now, what I see is that I noticed this in Saudi Arabia and other places. Over the years, the Arabs have become more and more fed up with Palestinian leadership because they find it's ineffectual, it's divided among itself. It passed up a number of opportunities, to make peace. And so while they, on the one hand, hate the Israeli right and Netanyahu for the way they treat the Palestinians, on the other hand, it's sort of like the Palestinians have themselves to blame. for this. And that's kind of the, what's emerged as the Arab attitude. That being said, remember that Saudi Arabia is not a normal Arab country. It's the custodian of the holy places. And because it's the custodian of the holy places, it can't just make a quick slapdash peace with Israel, because it's aware, especially in a social media age where one Twitter feed can go viral, that you could get another more bloody intifada with the snap of a finger could happen. And that's what the Saudis are worried about. It's this merging of an unresolved Palestinian problem with the destabilizing effects of social media.
Just staying on Saudi Arabia for just a second. I think the murder of Khashoggi was a terrible thing. I'm pretty established on that. I don't think it's a difficult thing to say that it was a terrible thing, and we should have protested it. And I get why the Washington Post won't let it go and considers it sort of a central thing. If something happened to a staffer at my outlet, I would have the same attitude. At the same time, it seems to me, as you referenced before, that MBS is directionally doing a lot of good things for Saudi Arabia. I may not agree with all of them, but does this sort of get at sort of the kind of realism that you advocate, which is you're going to have to deal with some SOBs in the real world, and constantly lecturing the Saudis doesn't get many returns.
Right. Remember when Franklin Roosevelt met with King Abdulaziz on the USS Quincy in, I think it was February 1945, Roosevelt wasn't there because he liked Abdulaziz, who had slaves,
Mm-hmm.
He, not only did he oppress women, but he had slaves. Did it because of oil. It was like, we don't like, we have nothing in common with these people, but we have to deal with them, in a post Cold War, in a post World War II order that's going to emerge. And I think the same thing is operative now. NBS, why did NBS, what's the real reason why NBS has allowed women to drive, to join the workforce, to take the hijab off, all of that stuff? It's because NBS very consciously knows that the 21st century, over time, gradually will see the end of the oil and gas age and the beginning of a renewable age. And he wants to get and he's young. And because he's young, he may be in power for decades and decades to come while this transition is happening. And he has to get Saudi Arabia to a point where it's a dynamic, entrepreneurial society. And you can't have that happen if you lock up half your population. So that's what's really behind we'll call it the liberation of women. And I have to tell you, it's quite striking. When you're in Saudi Arabia, when you're in an office or a hotel, women are everywhere behind the desks helping you. They're often much more dynamic and knowledgeable than the men. They're very out front, aggressive. There's been, it's an enormous change over the past half decade. And what that has done is it's made the men work harder. The men feel more insecure. Because if you unlock the gates for half the population, it changes the other half as well. So, that's what's happening. And I also think stabilizing relations with Israel, perhaps a rapprochement with Israel, something like that, also has to do with getting Saudi Arabia geared up for not the post-petroleum era, but an era that goes in gradually away from oil and gas, because he's got to get investment from Israel. He needs a lot of that high-tech stuff. This is all about making sure Saudi Arabia doesn't just fall apart as people buy less oil and gas during the period of his rule, which could last another 40 years or 50 years or so.
So, I mean, you know this stuff better than I do, but, there was this, it was basically the Kuznets curve for democracy, where once a country reached something like $6,000 per capita income, these numbers are now very old. Once it made a transition to democracy, it never went back, right? And the one exception to all that was always countries like Saudi Arabia that had the natural resources curse, where you didn't need a middle class. Historically, the democracy, one theory of where democracy comes from or liberalism comes from, is you get a bourgeois middle class that is heavily taxed, and because it's taxed, it then demands representation, for its taxation. And those expanding middle class rights break down nobility and aristocracy and blah, 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 blah. In resource rich countries, you have this problem where you can just use the middle class as clients rather than, and subsidize them rather than actually depend and extract rents from them. Does Saudi have the problem that if it actually becomes a dynamic economy with a real middle class, not a sort of welfare class middle class, that will actually be really destabilizing? Because China seems to realize that, and that's one of the reasons why they've gone a different way.
Yeah, I actually wrestle with that in the book, because I interview one Saudi after another who says human rights. I can get my passport renewed online without standing in a dirty government office. That's a human right. A woman can have 2 years off after birth, after giving birth, to be with her child. That's a human right. They kept listing to me conveniences and calling them human rights. And I said to myself, I write this, that right now for them, that's a human right. But as time goes on, populations are ungrateful. Give them something, they want something else, and middle classes especially are ungrateful. There will come a time when the Saudis, when young Saudis will equate human rights with stuff that we equate human rights with. We're just not at that point yet. And so, the more entrepreneurial and developed and dynamic Saudi becomes, the more harder to govern it will become without absolute outright oppression, because people will demand more. And you can't have, there's a retired scholar journalist of the Middle East from the Washington Post, David Ottaway, who makes the comparison. He said, is NBS like Icarus in the Greek myths, with wax wings flying too close to the sun? Because MBS wants technocracy, he wants efficiency, he wants entrepreneurship, but he also wants absolute total dictatorial control. And the question is, can he have both? Well, for the time being, he can have both. But at some point, something has to give. Because if he develops this society that he wants to develop, that society, simply by becoming more globalized and hooked up to the world, may demand more human rights in the Western sense.
All right, let's switch to China for a second, which is sort of has some analogs to the Saudi problem, right? If you had to choose, would you rather have America's problems or China's problems right now?
I'd rather have America's problems. I know that's an extreme statement in a way, because you wrote a book about, the horrors of what's happened to American democracy.
I'd still rather have America's problems too, just so you know, but I'm with you.
Yeah, yeah. China's problems are deeply structural. It's way in debt to a degree we can't even imagine. It's an oil importer. It's a natural gas importer. We're energy self-sufficient. China's borders are a headache, even though they've made border arrangements with all the country. They've got North Korea. They've got India. They have Russia, which, with all the great, bear hugging between Putin and Xi, the history of the Chinese-Russian relationship along its borders is pretty bad, and could get bad again. Whereas our borders are very benign. We have two oceans. We have a thin band of Canadian middle-class civilization to our north. And our only difficult border is in the southwest with Mexico. And that's because, and this is a whole other subject, Northern South America and Central America have turned into gang violence. Gangs control so many of these countries beneath the patina of elections that people are fleeing anarchy. They're fleeing the absolute absence of rule of law. And and that's what's driving them to the border. But compared to China, our border problems are much less. We have more natural resources in many ways. And also the thing about American history that always strikes me is how we can reinvent ourselves. The Jacksonian Revolution, the progressives at the turn of the 20th century, the New Deal. Just when people are about to write us off, we come up with something. Something happens. So, and I think just imagine if Donald Trump were to die tomorrow, or something, or were for some reason or another to flame out in the primaries or something, suddenly we may look very different at American democracy, because we're under the sway, a sizable minority of the population has been under the sway of a demagogue, And once he's gone from the scene, you could write a lot, things could look much more optimistic.
I think that's right. I think that, getting closer to my bailiwick, you take Trump out of the equation, most of the Trump imitators in the Republican Party are pretty pathetic and are not particularly good at winning an argument. Vivek Ramaswamy is having his sort of neo-isolationist moment, but I think it's going to be a short-lived moment. But the other structural problems with China is, one, people always used to say it was going to get old before it got rich. It does have a huge middle class that's rich for sure, but it also still got a ton of poor people. And now it's got this demographic decline problem where they're begging people to have more than one kid. That worries me in terms of the social unrest that it could bring. And so I'm just wondering, where do you come down on where Xi is going in the next 5 years? Do you think he's going to make a play for Taiwan? A military play?
Look, Xi's goal was always to be the opposite of Gorbachev. Gorbachev liberated the society and thought he could reform it. He could reform the economy and also liberate its politics at the same time. And that led to chaos and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Xi is not going to do any liberalization on the top, essentially. Xi's problem is that he wants more control, he wants more Leninism, but what that means is you're putting economic and financial power into the hands of people who are ideologues more than they're economists or financiers, and that will lead to mistakes. It has led to mistakes. It will lead to mistakes. I think that he's he's the polar opposite of Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping was a real classic Mandarin, from in the old Chinese way. He was eminently practical and wise. And Deng Xiaoping was on the route to liberating China, not as a democracy, but is basically a soft, enlightened, collegial, risk-averse authoritarianism, which Deng's successors, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, all agreed with. Xi has taken it in a real Leninist direction. He's got more power and is feared more than any Chinese leader since Mao. And I don't see this ending well. It may take a decade or two, but I just don't see this ending well for China.
I do want to get your take on this. So in the context of the sort of neo-great game that we're increasingly into, and the projection of power and the need to be realistic about these things, America's, I'm fine with anybody who said we needed to pull out of Afghanistan. But the manner in which we pulled out of Afghanistan, how consequential do you think it was? Do you think there was a way to pull out without those kinds of consequences? And or was this sort of baked into the cake? No matter what, it was going to be this ugly thing, which has its own problems.
I think the ugly withdrawal from Afghanistan had an ironic effect. It made Putin assume that the Biden administration was weak and pathetic. And it may have entered into his calculations and why he thought he could get away with invading Ukraine. And it had a double ironic effect because the Biden administration itself was so devastated by the mistakes it made that it had a kind of come to Jesus moment, because it knew there were other crises ahead. And the team, as a team, CIA, state, the National Security Council, the Pentagon, had to function better in future crises. So I think if they didn't have the impetus, this shame from the failure in Afghanistan, they might not have handled Ukraine as well as they have. And I think they've handled it pretty well so far. It's been the greatest demonstration of American power since the first Gulf War and the elder Bush. And even if it goes into a stalemate, it's steadily weakening the Russian Empire. It makes it harder and harder for Putin to project power in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, in the Russian Far East, because he just doesn't have the wherewithal for it. So I'm not as down on the Biden administration in Ukraine as others are. But I think of course, and someone who made this point crystal clear in an op-ed was Fred Kagan, I think in the New York Times, about how we should have withdrawn from Afghanistan. He said, basically, fine, you want to withdraw, that's okay. Here's how you do it. You don't do it, in the summer during the fighting season. You do it at the beginning of winter. You don't set any date certain publicly. You don't tie it to any symbolic event, because it becomes a symbolic event on the other side, and it encourages them to fight even harder and humiliate you. There are good, whether or not we should have withdrawn, the manner in which we did could have been done much better.
Yeah, as I say, I think it is a perfectly colorable, defensible position to say we should have gotten out of Afghanistan. I think the manner in which we did it was soaked up with all sorts of pretty consequential problems. But I'm just kind of curious. What do you think, if in fact we're entering in essentially into a new age of empire, and that we need to pivot to Asia, as the conventional wisdom constantly tells us, which I'm not saying is wrong, isn't having a forward base with all sorts of monitoring and force projection in terms of air power right in the middle of that entire neighborhood something of value in a pure neo-realist Machiavellian realpolitik kind of way? Forget what it says about people who accuse us of American empire. If you're fine with American empire, wouldn't you want to be able to project power from right there?
It became too costly. It simply became too costly because none of our original goals from invading Afghanistan in October 2001 could be met at all. And the fact is, we have no real interest in Afghanistan. The Chinese have mineral interests in Afghanistan. So do the Indians have interests in Afghanistan. We had too little interest. And it was too costly to maintain, to kind of keep us there for year upon year upon year.
Okay, I don't want to abuse my time with you, but just since we talked about Russia, I very much am sympathetic to your view about how order is very, very important for humans, and it's actually more important than democracy and human rights, right? Because basically order involves things like personal safety, the ability to live in a relatively normal life, right? To make a living, to take care of your kids. If you don't have that, people don't. That's why people say, self-protection is the first human right. It's like you have to feel like it's a safe world that you're in, and order provides that more than democracy does. I get all that, and I agree with all that, and I understand that the problem with disorder at scale is huge. Russia, I am increasingly of the mind that Russia is not an actual nation state. It is a very old land empire that has produced some wonderful literature and some really nice architecture, but has not actually entered modernity in some very important ways. And you just look at the continuity of their military philosophy about going back to czars, straight through the Soviet Union to Vladimir Putin, basically using their own troops as mine detectors and machine gun nest detectors. It's a pretty barbaric country, and their rationale for imperialism, I can find no redeemable moral case for it. So that said, I don't want a whole bunch of little warlord states with nuclear weapons either. So, what do you think is the future of Russia, or what do you think is the future of Russia that is most possible for America to nudge Russia towards?
First of all, I really like your phrase, it hasn't entered modernity, because Russia was denied the Enlightenment partly because of the Mongols. It's a classic insecure land power in the sense that it covers half the longitudes of the earth, but has no natural borders really that are protective in any way. It's been invaded not just by Hitler and Napoleon, but by Swedes, Lithuanians, Poles, and on over the centuries. So it's driven by insecurity, and insecurity leads to overstretch, And I think that where the Biden administration is in a very difficult position because I'll give you an example. Indicting Putin in the International Court of The Hague, that sort of presupposes that there will soon be a post-Putin Russia and that it will be a benign post-Putin Russia. But those are big things to presuppose. I'm not so sure I'm with the, I buy all of that. The truth is, Russia has always been more weakly institutionalized than China. If Xi Jinping got sick tomorrow, the Chinese regime would hold fast, would elect a new leader, maybe with a different orientation. But China is governed by institutions as much as by a dictator, whereas Russia has very weak institutions. After Putin, it's a black box. Nobody really knows.
So, but do you think, because I agree with you, I keep bringing it up, this Orlando Figes book I read about the story of Russia.
Oh, I read it too. A People's Tragedy.
This one is called The Story of Russia. And
that's the short one. Yeah, that's the short one. Yeah, he's wonderful.
I mean, my lips were sufficiently tired after reading it, but he makes a very good case about how Russia did not have a civil society really to speak of until like the 19th century, and didn't have time to really take root. And anyway, it seems to me like, you talk about how it's weak institutions or it works from insecurity. There's something really terrifying about countries that have that are pre-modern but have a salvific self-conception that they think they're the saviors of civilization, when in fact they are not entirely civilized themselves. I agree with you. You can't predict the future, but let's say Putin succumbs to this really terrible epidemic of people accidentally falling out of windows in Russia. Do you think that the borders of, I mean, you're sort of a Sam Huntington guy, right? I mean,
yeah. Great admirer of his. Yeah.
Are the borders of what we call Russia sacrosanct? Like the borders of a lot of countries are the borders, right? I mean, like you can argue about plus or minus a couple miles here or there, but historic Russia is a moving target. It expanded, like the size of Belgium every, couple of years or whatever. Do you think there is enough national, sub-Russian national and identity that you could see Russia in 20 years not being all of these countries? Not being one country, I should say.
Russia has fallen apart a few times in its long history and has always come back together as an empire. So I would never count Russia fully out. Its western borders are pretty fixed because of NATO. Those are pretty fixed borders. What we're really talking about is Russian influence in places like Dagestan, Kazakhstan, and other places. That's, that realm of influence, which makes, in a spiritual sense, an empire more than a state, can certainly change. And we could be entering a world where China, with all of its economic weaknesses that now we're reading a lot about, could actually gain an even deeper foothold than it currently has in former Soviet Central Asia, in the former Soviet Caucasus, etc., so that China will be more than just an Asian power, it'll be a Eurasian power.
All right, just last question. I could do this all day with you. Competitiveness. I've always had a big problem with competitiveness. I don't agree with Paul Krugman, right? But Paul Krugman of the mid-1990s, I actually do agree with on a few things. And the idea that is overtaking so much of both the left and the right in America is this idea that free trade is bad if it means losing domestic capacity to do things. And I'm okay with those arguments in the hard national security sphere. Like, we should make more of our artillery shells here. I'm open to that, right? But if China were to have a financial crash tomorrow, if that debt crisis hit a tipping point, it would be very good in terms of competitiveness if Chinese GDP dropped 50%. But it would also just be very bad for America in terms of standard of living, the global economy, global stability. How should we think about competitiveness and interdependency? Because highly integrated global markets have made us more vulnerable to what happens in other countries. But at the same time, they are to the benefit of, it's not a zero-sum game. And there's a lot of zero-sum thinking all over the place these days.
Yeah. The way I think about it is, there has to be equality of opportunity, you need really competitive colleges, medical schools, all of that, which are pretty value neutral in terms of who they admit. Because if we start playing games with that, we won't get incompetence. We'll just get mediocrity, over time. So being competitive within our state, within our country, that's what I think. I think that, free trade, one of the reasons why Trump was elected in 2016 was his backlash against the elite version of free trade with China and South Korea and other places. This feeling, imagined or not, that the elites were benefiting more from this free trade regime than a lot of people in the interior of the country were. So I think, though, we're entering a more globalized, claustrophobic, anxious, interconnected world where geography is not being defeated, it's being shrunk. And in that kind of a world, we're better off with free trade than is just bastions of just bastions of countries that all have an industrial policy or something like that.
All right, Robert D. Kaplan, thank you so much for doing this. The latest book is The Loom of Time: Between Empire and Anarchy, from the Mediterranean to China. It's a wonderful read. I haven't finished it, but I'm turning page. I was turning pages quite rapidly yesterday, going through it. I've been a fan of your stuff for a very long time, and I highly recommend it. And thank you again for coming on The Remnant.
It's been my pleasure, Jonah.
Okay, so Robert Kaplan has left the studio. I feel like I didn't quite do the book the service it deserved, because it really is just like a lot of his stuff. It's just the sweeping, tour. What do the French say? Tour de raison, tour of the Middle East with real granular color on the ground. He's a wonderful writer, but he also sounds like it could be my Uncle Morty. But anyway, I want to thank Professor Kaplan, or, well, why not Professor Kaplan? I call everybody Professor, for coming on. And I want to thank everybody out there for listening, and feel like there's, again, I do this to myself. I feel like there's something I'm supposed to be telling you people, and I can't think of what it is. So why don't I just tell you, once again, to become a paying member of the Dispatch. Lots more stuff coming down the pike, more meetups, more special for member only audio content. It has now been announced that Declan Garvey is the new executive editor of the Dispatch. We're very excited about it. Declan was the chief author of the Morning Dispatch, and now he's going to rule with an iron fist. Adam O'Neill, who was the executive editor, has taken a job as the Washington correspondent for The Economist, which we want to congratulate him for. We're very excited about Declan's new role, and we think great things are coming. Oh, and for instance, we're going to do a sort of a experiment we're not doing Dispatch Live. We're recording this on Tuesday, August 22nd. So we're not going to do our normal Dispatch Live for members only, where we do this video thing with various members of the Dispatch, do some alcohol lubricated punditry. Instead, we are going to do a special Dispatch Live for post-debate commentary. I'm not sure who all is going to be on, but I'm going to try and be there. And I think Steve will try and be there. And it'll be a cavalcade of guest stars. It'll be like a very special episode of The Love Boat. There's still time. If you check in, if you subscribe, you can listen to that or watch that, because it's video. It's very exciting, this new technology video. And then you can catch up with it later on as a Dispatch podcast, conceivably, if it goes as brilliantly as our own Adam plans on it going. And with that, I want to say thanks again for listening, and I will see you next time.
No, you won't, because this is a podcast.